That has, I guess, a particular way of thinking about architecture, which is played out through a whole range of different kinds of projects, from social housing to education, but also including nightclubs, shop interiors, art installations, and things like teaching and writing too. So it's a very broad understanding of what architecture is, but we've always believed that you also have to be making projects for it to really be enacted, for the ideas to really become real. So our position really at FAT is that architecture should be something which is a communicative art, and we think, for example, we live in an age of communication, not an age of industry, and architecture somehow should be able to reflect that or respond to it. That architecture itself is a form of media in the same way that we're surrounded by cell phone broadcasts and the internet and so on. That architecture too is exactly part of that spectrum. I think the role of architects in contemporary society is really to form a kind of interface between, let's say, sets of ideas about space, or sets of ideas about what architecture might be, and the kind of practical and social situations in which architecture is needed or is wanted, and that translation of kind of ideals within architecture to very specific moments, very specific locations, very specific communities, I think is the job of the architect, in a sense to kind of articulate the problems which face them, because these are problems not just for architects, they're the problems of the society and the communities within which they're working. For FAT, we've always looked to try to understand ways in which architecture can be, say, relevant to contemporary culture, and that I think means both looking forwards but also looking backwards. And what it often means is trying to reject the kind of contemporary mainstream, the kind of things which architects do and the stuff which architecture looks like, and to find ways of kind of making it seem fresh. For us, it's a strange idea of innovation in the sense that it doesn't use the tropes which architecture usually uses of like technological progress. It's often exactly the opposite. It's often reaching back into history, but somehow using contemporary techniques or contemporary materials or a contemporary take on the things which you find, which allow us to, let's say, progress or to make things which excite us and hopefully excite the people that we work for. I think for us, the internet's been very important. We started as an office in around 95. I mean, officially we started in 95. We've been doing things a little bit before that. And so one of the first things that we did in the sort of international sense was set up a website, which now sounds pretty boring, but at the time was quite exciting. I think because it was a moment where nobody knew exactly what the internet was. Like, it hadn't even evolved into the kind of online portfolio which most architects' websites are now, or it hadn't become news. It hadn't become endless stream of project after project after project. So it was a kind of weird zone which allowed us to, first of all, develop, I guess, ideas through writing, through graphics, through that kind of pre-blog, pure HTML internet. And I think that's it. That also has been important, not just in terms of developing ideas, but also in terms of networking, also in terms of finding people who you might have something in common with, or opening up opportunities where you have some kind of common interest. So I think finding ways to express yourself as an architect beyond the traditional means, I think is increasingly important. Finding ways to make yourself visible, but also challenging yourself to make yourself, I guess, relevant and interesting within these fairly new media environments. I guess networking is it's fundamental to how architecture works, because despite the fact that buildings don't talk, architecture is all about people, and that ranges from ideas within architecture, but it also certainly links to commissions, and it certainly links to opportunities. I think for us, networking's been really important in terms of developing arguments, developing positions, finding people who you can talk to about the kinds of things you're interested in, has been really fundamental to our own progression. Equally, it's been really important in terms of getting opportunities to build, and so, we try to meet as many people as we can. It's a very strange thing to study because, in a sense, there isn't anything in particular to learn. I think there's something about an attitude. I don't know if you can learn that. My own experience was I had a kind of split education. Part of it was incredibly traditional, it was all about drawing plans and sections, and the other half of it was completely the opposite. It was kind of wild and speculative, and that worked brilliantly for me, but it was entirely accidental. But I think that you certainly need to have some kind of technical disciplinary foundation which will then allow you to find ways of operating, and that often education now moves directly to the speculative, which I think it can be dangerous and can leave things kind of very watery, very without any kind of contact with the real world. And I think while that might be interesting in a fictional sense, it's not enough of a challenge to architecture which operates in the real world. It might have been a different generation, a different circumstance to now. Or actually, it's probably very similar to now. We started at the end of the last recession in the UK, so that's kind of mid-90s, early 90s. And we started that straight out of college, but we didn't start it as an architecture practice because the idea of being a young architect in Britain at that time was completely ridiculous. There just weren't any. So we began by exploring architectural ideas through any other form of media. So the name FAT, for example, came from a magazine, which we never made. We began to make projects which were kind of temporary, kind of curated art, urban art projects. And only gradually did we move into building, and that began with nightclubs, and it moved on to advertising agencies, and then we finally got to build a building. And so it's been a very slow progression, and I think one which is kind of at odds with the idea of starting an architecture practice these days. And I'd certainly say that lack of success in terms of square meters you build as fast as possible, I think is no problem at all. We've found that having the opportunity to think, having the opportunity to kind of having to invent your own ways of making architecture